Lila wiped her hands on her stained apron, her movements slow and mechanical. The hum of the diner surrounded her. Plates clinking, murmured conversations, the occasional bark of an impatient customer. She had worked here for 3 years, and each day seemed to blur into the next, a ceaseless grind with no end in sight. At 25, she had imagined her life would be different. Dreams of art school, traveling, and freedom felt like distant whispers now, swallowed by the relentless weight of her reality. Her shift ended late that night, and as she stepped outside, the chill of the autumn air cut through her thin jacket. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring down at the crumpled envelope in her hand. Another bill, another impossible demand for money she didn't have. Her mother's medical debts seemed insurmountable, no matter how many double shifts she worked or how many nights she went without sleep. She sighed and began walking toward the tiny apartment she rented above a laundromat, her steps heavy with exhaustion. She didn't notice the sleek black car parked across the street until the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his gray hair slicked back, his posture exuding an air of authority. Lila paused, her pulse quickening as he approached. "Miss Evans?" he asked, his voice deep and measured. "Yes," she replied hesitantly, clutching her bag tightly. "My employer would like to speak with you," the man said, gesturing toward the car. Lila took a step back. "I don't know who your employer is, but I'm not interested." The man's expression didn't change. "I think you'll want to hear what he has to say. He's prepared to make your financial troubles disappear." The words hung in the air, heavy with temptation. Lila's heart raced as she considered his offer. Her instinct screamed at her to walk away. But the thought of finally escaping the crushing weight of her debt was too enticing to ignore. After a long moment, she nodded. The man opened the car door for her, and she slid inside. The interior was luxurious, the leather seats soft beneath her. Across from her sat an older man, his piercing blue eyes studying her intently. He looked to be in his 70s, his face lined with age, but there was an undeniable charisma about him. "Miss Evans," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I'm Edward Ashcroft. You may have heard of me." Lila blinked. Of course, she had heard of him. Edward Ashcroft was a billionaire, a man whose name appeared in the news as often as the weather. He was known for his vast business empire, his extravagant lifestyle, and his ruthless reputation. "I'll get straight to the point," Edward continued. "I know about your debts. I know you're struggling to make ends meet. I can make all of that go away. Every bill, every penny you owe. It will all be taken care of." Lila frowned, her suspicion growing. "And what do you want in return?" Edward smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I need a wife." The words hit her like a thunderclap. She stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, to reveal that this was some sort of twisted joke. But his expression remained serious. "A wife?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, a temporary arrangement, lasting no more than a year. You'll have access to anything you need, money, a home, security. In return, you'll play the role of my devoted spouse. Think of it as a business transaction." Lila's mind raced. The proposal was absurd, unthinkable. But as she looked at Edward, she saw no sign of deception. He was entirely serious. "Why me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You're unconnected, unambitious, and frankly desperate," Edward replied bluntly. "You're exactly the type of person who won't complicate things. And in exchange, you'll have a chance to start over, to be free." Lila's stomach churned at his words. She felt insulted, humiliated, and yet she couldn't deny the temptation. The idea of escaping her current life, of finally being free from the suffocating grip of debt, was almost too good to resist. "I'll need time to think about it," she said, her voice shaky. Edward inclined his head. "Of course, but I wouldn't wait too long. Offers like this don't come around often." The car dropped her off at her apartment, and Lila spent the night tossing and turning, her thoughts a tangled mess. By morning, the decision weighed heavily on her. She didn't want this life. She didn't want to be tied to a man she barely knew, a man old enough to be her grandfather. But what choice did she have? Her back was against the wall, and Edward knew it. 3 days later, she stood in front of a judge, her hands trembling as she signed the marriage license. Edward was calm and composed, his demeanor that of a man closing a business deal. The ceremony was quick and devoid of emotion. No friends, no family, no celebration. Just a signature and a hollow exchange of vows. Lila felt numb as she followed Edward to his mansion, a sprawling estate that seemed to stretch on forever. The grandeur of the place was overwhelming, but it did little to ease the sinking feeling in her chest. She was officially Mrs. Edward Ashcroft, and yet she felt more like a prisoner than a wife. The first night in the mansion was eerily quiet. Edward had retired to his separate wing of the house, leaving Lila alone in her lavishly decorated room. She stared at the ornate ceiling, her mind a whirlwind of doubts and fears. She had made her choice, but the weight of it pressed down on her, suffocating and inescapable. As the days passed, she tried to adjust to her new reality. The staff treated her with respect, but their gazes lingered just a second too long, as if they were judging her. Edward was polite but distant, speaking to her only when necessary. It was clear that this arrangement was purely transactional, with no room for genuine connection or affection. Lila spent most of her time wandering the mansion, exploring its endless halls and opulent rooms. She felt like an intruder in someone else's life, a ghost haunting a world that didn't belong to her. And yet, beneath the surface, a nagging thought began to take root. What had she truly agreed to? One evening, as she stood by the grand staircase, staring out at the sprawling gardens below, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had stepped into something far more complicated than she'd anticipated. There was an emptiness in Edward's eyes, a coldness that hinted at secrets she couldn't begin to unravel. For now, she could only wait and see what those secrets might reveal. The days in Edward's mansion were long and uneventful, filled with silence that stretched endlessly. Lila moved through the grand halls like a shadow, unnoticed and unremarkable. The staff spoke to her with a measured politeness, but their eyes often betrayed quiet judgment, as though they knew she didn't belong. She couldn't blame them. She felt the same. The weight of the marriage felt heavier with each passing day, the arrangement colder and more transactional than even she had anticipated. Edward's presence was distant, his interactions with her limited to brief, perfunctory conversations. He treated her like an obligation, a means to an end. One afternoon, Lila was wandering through the vast library, running her fingers along the spines of old, leather-bound books, when a voice startled her. "You seem lost." She turned quickly, her heart skipping a beat, and found herself looking into the piercing hazel eyes of a man she hadn't seen before. He was tall, with a lean, athletic build, dressed casually in a crisp shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His dark hair was slightly tousled, giving him an air of effortless charm. He smiled, a boyish grin that felt disarming. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, stepping closer. "I'm James, Edward's assistant." Lila nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I wasn't expecting anyone." "Well, I'm here more often than you'd think," James replied with a playful smirk. "Though I can see why we might have missed each other. You seem to keep to yourself." She hesitated, unsure how to respond. There was something in his tone, warmth, maybe even curiosity, that caught her off guard. It had been weeks since anyone had spoken to her like this, with genuine interest rather than cold detachment. James gestured toward the shelf she'd been examining. "Looking for anything in particular?" "Not really," she admitted. "Just passing time." "Fair enough," he said, leaning casually against the edge of a table. "This place can feel suffocating if you're not used to it. All the grandeur, the rules, the silence. It can wear on you." Lila's gaze flicked toward him, surprised by his candidness. He seemed out of place in Edward's meticulously controlled world, too relaxed, too alive. She found herself smiling faintly for the first time in days. "You're not what I expected," she said softly. "Neither are you," he replied, his eyes locking onto hers. The moment stretched, a subtle undercurrent of connection passing between them before Lila broke the gaze, her cheeks flushing. In the days that followed, James seemed to appear everywhere. He was always composed, always ready with a light-hearted comment or an offer to help. Unlike Edward, whose every word felt calculated, James was open and approachable. They began to talk more, their conversations growing longer, the topics more personal. He listened to her in a way no one else had, asking about her life before the marriage, her dreams, her fears. It was intoxicating. The way he made her feel seen in a house that seemed determined to erase her. But there was danger in those moments, and Lila knew it. She felt it every time James's hand brushed against hers, every time his laughter lingered in the air. Her heart betrayed her, beating faster whenever he was near, and she hated herself for it. She had made a choice, no matter how unpalatable, and she was bound by it. Still, she couldn't deny the growing pull between them. It was as though the emptiness of her marriage had created a vacuum, and James was rushing in to fill it. He was kind where Edward was cold, attentive where Edward was indifferent, and though she tried to push the thoughts away, a small, rebellious part of her couldn't help but wonder what it might be like to let herself fall into him completely. The turning point came one evening, after a particularly tense dinner with Edward. He had been in a foul mood, snapping at the staff and dismissing Lila's attempts at conversation with a wave of his hand. By the time the meal was over, she felt like an invisible burden, someone to be endured rather than acknowledged. She fled to the garden, seeking solace in the cool night air, and found James waiting there, leaning against a stone pillar. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said softly, stepping toward her. Lila crossed her arms over her chest, her voice sharper than she intended. "Why not? What does it matter?" James stopped, his expression softening. "It matters to me." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Lila looked away, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You don't know what it's like to feel trapped." "I do," James said, his voice low. He moved closer, his presence warm and steady. "More than you think." Lila turned to face him, the raw emotion in his gaze sending a shiver through her. For a moment, she let herself believe him, let herself lean into the comfort he offered. When his hand brushed against her cheek, she didn't pull away, and when he kissed her, she didn't stop him. The kiss was electric, igniting something within her that had been dormant for far too long. It was wrong, and she knew it. But in that moment, with James's arms around her, she didn't care. The world fell away, and all that remained was the way he made her feel, alive, desired, free. They pulled apart eventually, the weight of what they'd done crashing down around them. James searched her face, his expression torn. "Lila," she shook her head, stepping back. "I can't. I shouldn't." "I know," he said quietly, "but that doesn't change how I feel." Lila turned away, her heart pounding. She wanted to tell him to leave, to end whatever this was before it went any further. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she walked back to the house, her emotions in turmoil. The days that followed were a blur of stolen glances and whispered words. They were careful, always careful, but the tension between them was impossible to ignore. Lila felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the fall would destroy her, but unable to step back. And then there were the moments with Edward, his sharp gaze lingering on her a second too long, his cryptic comments that made her wonder if he knew. She felt like a glass about to shatter, her guilt and fear mounting with every passing day. But despite it all, she couldn't stop herself. She was in too deep, and the line between right and wrong had blurred beyond recognition. All she could do now was wait, knowing that whatever was coming would change everything. The air in the mansion was thick with an unspoken tension that Lila couldn't shake. Edward's presence loomed heavier now, his silence more pointed, his eyes sharper when they lingered on her. She told herself it was paranoia, that he couldn't possibly know. But each time she sat across from him at the long dining table or passed him in the hall, the feeling intensified, a knot tightening in her stomach. James had grown more cautious too. Their stolen moments were brief now. Their conversations hurried, both of them retreating into a shared unease that neither dared to name. Lila hated the distance, but knew it was necessary. Whatever this thing between them had become, it was dangerous. And Edward, cold, calculating Edward, was not a man to be crossed. One evening, Edward summoned her to his study. The summons itself was unusual. He rarely sought her out. She found him seated behind an enormous mahogany desk, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. The room was dimly lit. The only sound the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Lila obeyed, her pulse quickening. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap, trying to steady her breathing. Edward studied her for a long moment, his piercing blue eyes seeming to bore into her. "You've been quiet lately," he said at last, his tone measured. "I didn't think you'd notice," she replied, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She immediately regretted it, but Edward only chuckled a low, humorless sound. "I notice everything, Lila," he said, "and I've noticed a change in you. Something's different." Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I don't know what you mean." Edward leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Don't play coy with me. I'm not a fool." The weight of his words hung between them, suffocating. Lila's mind raced, searching for a response, an explanation, anything that might deflect his scrutiny. But before she could speak, Edward leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think I don't know about James?" Her heart stopped. The blood drained from her face as his words sank in, and for a moment, she forgot how to breathe. He knew. He had known all along. She began, but Edward cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Spare me your excuses," he snapped. "Do you think I married you without knowing what kind of person you are? Do you think I didn't plan for this?" Lila's chest tightened, her hands trembling in her lap. "Plan for what?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Edward's lips curled into a cold, mirthless smile. "This marriage was never about companionship or affection, Lila. It was a test, a trap, if you will. I wanted to see how long it would take for you to reveal your true nature." She stared at him, her mind reeling. "What are you talking about?" He rose from his chair, pacing slowly around the room. "I've spent my life surrounded by vultures, people who care only for my wealth and what they can take from me. My children, my business partners, even my so-called friends, they're all the same. Greedy, self-serving parasites." He stopped in front of her, his gaze icy. "When I married you, I knew you were desperate, vulnerable, easy to manipulate. I chose you because you were the perfect pawn in my game, and you didn't disappoint." Lila's stomach churned, nausea rising as his words cut through her. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said, her voice trembling. "No," Edward agreed, "but you accepted it, and then you betrayed me, just like everyone else." Tears stung her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice raw. "Because the game is over," he said coldly, "and I've won." He walked back to his desk, pulling a folder from one of the drawers. He placed it in front of her and opened it, revealing a stack of photographs. Lila's breath caught in her throat as she recognized herself in James, captured in moments she thought had been private. A hand brushing against his, a lingering glance, a kiss stolen in the shadows of the garden. Her vision blurred as the full weight of her actions bore down on her. "What are you going to do with these?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward's smile returned, colder than before. "That depends on you. I could expose you both, ruin his career, destroy whatever shred of dignity you have left. Or," he paused, letting the word hang ominously. You can leave. Quietly. No money, no assets, no ties to me or this life. Just disappear. Lila's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She felt trapped, cornered, every option a dead end. You were never going to let me have a future, were you? She said bitterly. Edward tilted his head, as if considering her words. You created your own future, Lila. I simply gave you the opportunity to show me who you really are. She rose from her chair, her legs unsteady beneath her. You're a cruel, vindictive man, she said, her voice shaking with anger. You think you've won, but all you've proven is how empty your life is. Edward's expression didn't falter. Perhaps. But at least I have the satisfaction of knowing I was right about you. Lila turned and walked out of the study, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop until she reached her room, where she collapsed onto the bed, tears streaming down her face. She had made mistakes, terrible, unforgivable mistakes, but she refused to let Edward define her. The next morning, she packed her belongings and left the mansion, her head held high despite the storm raging inside her. James was waiting for her at the gates, his expression torn between guilt and sorrow. I'm so sorry, Lila, he said, his voice heavy with regret. She shook her head, forcing a small, sad smile. It's not your fault, James. We made our choices, and now we have to live with them. As she walked away, the weight of the past weeks pressed down on her, but she felt a flicker of hope. She had been broken, humiliated, and betrayed, but she wasn't defeated. For the first time in years, she was free to rebuild, to start over, to find a life that was truly her own. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Lila vowed to never again let herself be defined by the expectations or manipulations of others. She would rise from the ashes of her mistakes, stronger and wiser, and create a future that belonged to her alone.